The Sahara Desert is, without exaggeration, one of the harshest regions on the planet, but most people know that to some degree or another. What's often underappreciated, though, is just how massive it is. It is, by far, the largest hot desert on the planet, and in fact, for comparison, it's about 1 million square kilometers larger than the entire contiguous United States. Now imagine trying to cross it, let alone build something across it. That is exactly what happened in the 1880s, and the results would be horrifying. But not just because of the harsh terrain. As always, viewer discretion is strongly advised. By the early 1880s, a race to invade and colonize Africa by European countries was intensifying. During this period, which is known as the Scramble for Africa, European powers were slicing up the continent at will with the belief that colonization was somehow their right. For France, one of the boldest ideas to come out of this period was the plan to build a railway straight across the Sahara Desert, linking Algeria to French Sudan, which is modern-day Mali, and then from there, eventually to the rich territories of West Africa. If this sounds impossible to you, you're not alone in thinking that, but if anyone was going to do it, a man named Paul Flatters wanted to be the man who made it happen. Now, Paul wasn't exactly the poster child for a grand desert adventure. By the time he was asked to lead the expedition, he was 48 years old and graying, with a fair complexion and an average build. He apparently carried himself with intensity and had a reputation for being both straightforward and stubborn, but years of hard living in Algeria had taken their toll. He suffered from chronic sciatica and was known to rely heavily on morphine to manage the pain. His moods could also apparently swing without warning, but underneath the physical wear and tear was someone deeply devoted to the desert, fascinated by its people, obsessed with its trade routes, and convinced it could be the key to expanding France's colonial reach. You see, for Paul, the Sahara was more than just sand and heat. He'd spent years in North Africa as a military administrator, learning local dialects and studying the land. During that time, he'd built a sense that he understood the region far better than anyone in Paris did. So when word came down that the French government was looking for someone to scout a viable trade route for the Trans-Saharan Railway, Paul lobbied hard for the job. He wasn't the most obvious choice, but it seems as though he was certainly the most determined. And again, the goal of the project was nothing short of revolutionary. Building a railway across one of the harshest environments on Earth was no small feat, but France's interest in the Sahara wasn't new. For decades, the vast desert to the south of Algeria had represented mystery, trade routes, and the promise of connection to France's southern colonies. Up to that point, there just hadn't been enough political will, ambition, or maybe more likely, the naivete to try to make it happen. Because the challenge, other than the desert itself, was the people who already lived there. Chief among them were the Tuareg, who were a loose confederation of independent Berber tribes spread across an enormous swath of desert from Libya to Mali. To the French, the Tuareg were an obstacle, but to Paul, who was much more knowledgeable about the region, they were something in between political allies if approached correctly and deadly enemies if offended. In either case, he seemed to have a more realistic view of the land, but also a bit of an unrealistic belief that he could navigate the complexities. This was still better than the French imagination, which was that the Sahara had always been a blank spot on the map, as if it were some exotic unknown waiting to be charted, but the reality was far different. The Tuareg people weren't passive players in the story of European colonization. They had their own politics, alliances, and long memories of outsiders who tried to force their way in. And again, the desert itself was no passive backdrop either, with its harsh climate and oftentimes harsher terrain. But despite all of this, Paul was convinced that the right leader with the right approach could forge a path through it all. And so, with the blessing of the French government and a mixture of idealism and confidence, he prepared to make the attempt. When the French government began seriously exploring the idea of a Trans-Saharan Railway, they broke the plan into 3 routes: Western, Central, and Eastern. The first 2 would end up being scouted with little issue, but the Eastern route was the most dangerous since it passed through the heart of the Tuareg territory, where French presence was historically far less welcome and far more risky. That, of course, was the one Paul insisted on leading. Originally, Paul proposed bringing more than 200 armed soldiers for protection, but that idea was opposed by Henry Duveyrier, a veteran explorer who thought subtlety would be safer than force. Henry apparently had a bit more of a romantic view of the Tuareg people and argued that smaller expeditions adapted to local customs had a better shot at success. He described the Tuareg as honorable, peace-loving desert people. In reality, they were fiercely territorial and unafraid to defend their land, especially from colonial encroachment. A compromise was eventually struck and the expedition would go forward, but with less than half the manpower Paul wanted. But satisfied with this anyway, Paul returned to Algeria in November of 1879 and began assembling his team. On January 25, 1880, the group set out from Constantine near the northern coast, heading to Warglar, about 1,600 kilometers to the south. And for more context on size, that 600 kilometers is still only a fraction of the distance across Algeria alone. But in any case, the core group included 12 Europeans, some Algerian soldiers, local cameleers, and guides. A little over a month later, they departed Warglar and pushed into the desert, threading their way through valleys and past small towns. In fact, even before Warglar, they were already squarely in the expansive Sahara Desert. If you click around on Google Street View in the area, often all you'll see is vast sand dunes in every direction. The scale of it is really just hard to fathom, and it must have been grueling every day. The temperature, as of the time of writing this, averages over 40 degrees Celsius or around 105 degrees Fahrenheit in Warglar alone, let alone further in. By mid-April, the expedition had reached the edge of the territory and made camp near what was later determined to be an infrequent seasonal lake. It was here that things started to unravel. Supplies by this point were running low, and the locals were showing signs of hostility. The desert was also unrelenting, so Paul made the difficult but wise decision to turn back. The retreat north began on April 21st, but before they departed, Paul gave the captain assigned to the rear of the group a surprisingly dramatic order. He told them to essentially fight to the last man if necessary so the rest of the convoy could get away, clearly indicating that tensions were much higher than realized. Fortunately, the Tuareg didn't attack. Whether it was restraint or strategy, they let the French leave without issue. As they made the retreat, though, Paul sent a letter to the chief of the local Tuareg, promising to return the following winter. This was meant as a show of diplomacy, trying to ease the tensions. The expedition then arrived back in Warglar on May 17, 1880, battered but intact. It hadn't been a complete disaster, but it wasn't the triumph Paul had imagined either. Still, the mission had gathered useful information about the terrain and a river which looked promising as a possible railway route. To the French government, this was enough to justify trying again, giving Paul a chance to handle what he viewed as unfinished business. Paul didn't waste any time either, as the second expedition would be a more complex mission, and officially it was peaceful as it aimed to negotiate with Tuareg leaders and maybe even establish a permanent French consulate deep in the desert. But as with many colonial affairs, it seems clear no one really believed that's what it was all about. The unspoken goal was to assert themselves, secure trade routes, and stake France's claim on the region. In November of 1980, Paul set out once again from Warglar at the head of a group of more than 90 men. His team included engineers, officers, soldiers, guides, and volunteers, many of them North African locals with military experience. The journey began with cautious optimism, and on November 27th they reached an oasis, charting a slightly different route than the first expedition. A few days later, the expedition joined a caravan led by a prominent Sufi religious leader, hoping to signal to locals that this was a mission of peace. However, simultaneously, local tribesmen told Paul and the expedition leaders that entering Tuareg territory would bring trouble, but Paul brushed off these concerns. By the time mid-December rolled around, the expedition reached 150 kilometers from the Tuareg stronghold of Insalah. Paul then sent word of the expedition's arrival to the chief of the local Tuareg and waited 5 days for a response, but none came. The expedition then continued on, and the route took them along the edges of the Tadamate Plateau. They also passed ancient Roman ruins, which were the furthest Romans had traveled south, and from there they moved toward the Mali border. By this point, they were closing in close to 1,500 kilometers of travel through nothing but desert. On February 16, 1881, they stopped at Bir El Garama, which is a watering hole, to rest. They didn't know it at the time, but by the time they set foot near Bir El Garama, their fate had been sealed. The Tuareg had been preparing for the arrival of the French. In fact, before the French even left Warglar, word had spread through the desert and a coalition of Tuareg fighters began making plans to wipe out the expedition. It's even believed that some of the expedition's own guides had been feeding the Tuareg updates and steering the group deeper into hostile territory. By the time they reached them, around 600 armed fighters gathered near the wells, waiting for the French. The Tuareg had been shadowing the expedition, studying their movements, watching them get deeper into the desert and further from safety. And Paul, despite the growing unease around him, believed he was protected. He placed his trust in those around him and in the belief that Tuareg leadership would never allow violence against French guests in the territory. As they rested at the watering hole, Paul then made a fateful decision when he left the main camp behind with a group of officers and scientific staff along with several camels. A guide warned him that something felt off and that it wasn't safe, but as he had done before, Paul waved it off and assured the guide that there was nothing to fear. And right on cue, barely half an hour after finding the well, the group was surrounded. Tuareg fighters armed with lances and old muskets closed in from all directions. Chaos then erupted, and some men tried to get on the camels and run, but the spooked camels refused to move. What followed was swift and brutal. Paul and the entirety of the expedition's leadership were all killed, as were around 30 camel drivers. There would be no dramatic defense, just a group of men caught off guard and overrun by an enemy that knew the terrain and the weaknesses of their target. Only 10 men managed to escape the ambush, and the Tuareg took nearly all the expedition's 250 camels, leaving the rest of the men to die in the sand. The horror, however, wasn't over just yet. Back at the main camp, the remaining men had no idea what happened or how bad it was about to get. The sounds of gunfire and distant shouting eventually faded into sounds for those at the main camp. When it was realized what had happened, the remaining men were left staring down the reality of their situation. Although their camp hadn't been attacked yet, their commander was now dead and their supplies were scattered. And maybe most importantly, they were now stranded in the middle of the Sahara with no real escape plan. Once the dust had settled, the men had time to regroup. A man named Lieutenant Joseph Dianis took command of the 56 remaining men, including just 4 French officers. They still had some weapons to defend themselves, but the problem was, without camels, their ability to carry anything was severely limited. This led to the difficult decision to burn up most of the remaining supplies, just to keep them from falling into Tuareg hands. They also split up the food and ammunition and divided the mission's coins among themselves. The strongest men were also given the few water skins left that carried water, and with no time to waste and little choice, they began walking the 1,500 kilometers between them and Wargla. It's probably no surprise that it didn't take long for things to fall apart. The Tuareg, who had already taken so much from them, weren't finished either. They followed them from a distance, hunting animals and stealing what they could, keeping the remaining men constantly on edge. Hunger and thirst also set in quickly, and by February 22nd, less than a week later, the men were almost out of food. A few days later, they were eating anything they could find just to stay upright. As this was going on, some of these stronger men went ahead in hopes of finding animals or water, but there was just nothing waiting for them in the desert. And then with the survivors now probably at their most desperate, the Tuareg would turn once again for another brutal, but this time deceptive attack. A group of Tuareg then approached and offered the survivors milk, meat, and fruit at an almost extortionate high price, but the money mattered little at that moment. The survivors were also so desperate that they never stopped to consider the consequences of accepting food from them either. The dates, as it turned out, had been purposely laced with a toxic plant known for causing hallucinations, panic, and death. Shortly afterward, those who ate them apparently went insane. Some screamed and staggered, while others ran wildly into the desert, firing their guns and gasping for air as the poison burned their lungs. A few were saved by vomiting, but most who had them weren't so lucky. As if things couldn't get worse, while this was all going on, the Tuareg struck again. 3 of the guides who had refused the dates and knew better than to trust the offer were captured and then had their heads taken. A holy man who had accompanied the expedition was also finished in a way so gruesome that it shook even the Tuareg who witnessed it. As the attack erupted into chaos, survivors ran in all directions just to escape. This left a core group that was able to escape and continued stumbling north. However, already at the next town they encountered, the survivors were ambushed again by a force of Tuareg fighters already there waiting for them. A fight then broke out and Joseph was killed. Once again, the survivors scattered, breaking into smaller groups. And as the days went on, with each group under the immense stress of essentially being hunted, they also became increasingly paranoid that the others were hoarding food or water. This would lead to what little discipline that remained evaporating quickly. As starvation set in and exhaustion took hold, hunger more powerful than anything the men had experienced before began to set in. It didn't happen all at once, but as men began to die and survivors were too weak to bury them, those who remained found themselves with little choice. The last surviving Frenchman, Sergeant Joseph Paubeguin, resisted the descent into the unthinkable at first. When other soldiers gave one of the dying Algerian soldiers mercy, they offered him some for sustenance, but he refused. In time, though, the hunger won and he joined them, and before long, he too was dead and eaten. What began as a proud mission of exploration had become a nightmare of betrayal and survival at all costs. The survivors were little more than walking skeletons as the days passed, but on April 2nd, 4 Algerian soldiers stumbled into Wargla. A few others were then found along the route, either crawling or passed out in the sand. 2 days later, 11 more guides crawled into the town to tell the story no one could quite believe. They spoke of ambushes, poisoned dates, horrific attacks, and desert madness, everything they'd had to endure to reach the safety of the city. By the end of the month, around a dozen more survivors in total had traveled the 1,500 kilometers against impossible odds to end up in Wargla. When news of the disaster finally reached France, the reaction was immediate and furious. The press exploded with headlines demanding revenge. Politicians also called for swift military retaliation against the Tuareg and renewed efforts to conquer the Sahara once and for all. The sheer brutality of what had happened shocked a nation that had grown used to framing its colonial campaigns as noble missions of civilization. After the initial uproar, though, interest began to fade. The shock wore off and was replaced by hesitation. The loss of Paul and his men had exposed just how little France knew about the region and just how ill-equipped it was to control it. Plans for the Trans-Saharan Railway were then quietly shelved. Further military expeditions into the desert were delayed, and for nearly 20 years, the French pulled back from aggressive attempts to colonize the Central Sahara. The French public then quickly found someone to condemn for the failed expedition. Henry, the explorer who insisted on a soft approach and painted the Tuareg as noble and peaceful, bore the brunt of it. His romanticized view of the desert people now seemed tragically naive, and the press tore into him. He tried to defend his position with more expeditions, but the guilt followed him. In 1892, he would end things on his own accord, and it's believed to be a result of his guilt. What remained of the Flatters expedition were letters written before the first attack and scattered accounts from the few who survived. Ironically, those letters became some of the only detailed sources of information about the Central Sahara available to the French for decades. In the end, the expedition was a lesson in arrogance and in underestimating the people and the environment you're trying to control. And for the French, it was a moment of colonial defeat that they couldn't spin into something glorious. If you made it this far, thanks so much for watching. If you have a story suggestion, feel free to submit it to the forum found in the description. Also, if you want to support the channel, consider joining the Patreon or becoming a channel member here on YouTube. Anyways, thanks again, and hopefully I will see you in the next one.